I grew up in the 80s and 90s, right? Very much what I was taught, well, anything a guy can do, you can do it better. There was this girl power that was really intense in the 90s where we were really pushing women to assert themselves like men, right? Even the way that we dressed, women were dressing like men. I didn't want to be different from men, right? I wanted to be equal to them, and I wanted us to be the same because that's what I was told. Well, to be a woman, is actually like you're tough like a man, you do things like a man. But this idea of being a woman seemed weak, it seemed less than, and it didn't seem like something that I would want. So I liked the idea of equal, but I wasn't sure about the idea of different.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Lilarose podcast. Thanks so much for listening. The podcast continues to grow, and I just thank you so much for all of the support that you guys have given this show. The people on Patreon that have signed up and are supporting us monthly, thank you so much. You guys who are commenting, sharing episodes with friends and family. We're almost to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. I just want to thank you guys so much for that because your support means the world, and I'm having a blast doing the podcast. All right, so today we're going to be talking about some of these femininity questions in the context of what does it mean to be a woman, especially a woman of faith, a Christian woman, somebody who is living out her faith and truly living out her womanhood. Now, I think feminism, I think that some of the responses to feminism in our culture, there's a lot of confusion because of all of the ideologies everywhere. And there's a lot of woundedness. And so if you're listening and you're like, okay, I'm a single woman and I'm a Christian and I don't feel like there's really a place for me in the church. Or you're listening and you're like, okay, I am, a mother, I'm a wife, but I struggle with some of what I think the church is telling me and the faith is telling me about what it means to be a woman. These are questions that we're going to be exploring on the show today with speaker and author Lisa Cotter. Lisa Cotter is super down to earth. She's really fun. And she wrote a book recently called Reveal the Gift, about femininity, particularly the term she uses is the feminine genius. So she's going to describe what that is, what that means for especially women of faith, but really for all women, some of the differences between femininity and masculinity, and so much more. I think you're going to enjoy this episode. Let me know what you think. I love hearing from you guys. You can email me at lila@gtbmedia.com. That's lila@gtbmedia.com. You can also leave a comment on YouTube or leave us a review on your podcast app. Give the podcast 5 stars. That will help the podcast reach more people. Our sponsor today is Carly Jean Los Angeles. Carly Jean Los Angeles is the first clothing company and only that we have been promoting on the podcast because it's one that shares your values. They're also ethically sourced. The price point is great. And you can use the code lilarose at checkout for 20% off your order. So carlyjeanlosangeles.com is the company. You're going to find a lot of great options for the fall. You're going to find cute fall dresses, sweaters, jackets. They also have great basics. I actually have a bunch of their long sleeve and short sleeve shirts. They're really comfortable. They're well made. They've been wearing well. And then they've got great jeans. So check out carlyjeanlosangeles.com. Ethically sourced, very cute, fashion forward clothes, but also have a classics twist to them. So these are things that are not going to be out of style in a year or two. And you're just going to love what you find. carlyjeanlosangeles.com is the website, and you can use the code lilarose for 20% off your order. Lisa, thanks so much for coming into the studio today.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So you just finished with your book, Reveal the Gift. We have it here in the studio.
Yes, here it is.
And it's about femininity.
That's right.
Which is really a hot topic in today's culture.
Yes.
And so tell me first what inspired you to write this book, because this is not your first time you've done writing or speaking on femininity.
No, it's not. And the book really is the fruit of that writing and speaking. But how it all came about was really kind of interesting, actually, because it was not my intention to ever become an author on femininity. Like as a little girl, I was like, one day I'm going to write a book on this. No. How it all started is my husband and I, we were in a ministry for a long time that was for college students. It's called Focus, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students. And early on in the years of Focus, they just invited staff members to come and apply or to submit a breakout session for a conference. So one year I did that and the talk went well. And then the next year they said, hey, could you give a talk to all the women coming to the conference on authentic femininity? And my first response was, no, absolutely not. I do not want to give that talk, get up on stage and explain to these women how to be a woman or what that means to be a woman. It just completely overwhelms me. But I spent some time thinking about it and took it to prayer and realized, no, actually, this is something that I don't want to talk about because it's something that I don't understand. And it's something that honestly I kind of feared what the response would be. I didn't want to know what the response would be, particularly from the church, the Catholic Church. And so I kind of had avoided the topic. But then once I started to dive in and understand, okay, what is the history of femininity? What is this deeper meaning of what it means to be a woman? What I found was actually the opposite of what I thought I would find. What I thought I would find would be something that was going to put me in this tight little box, right? Like, here's this box, and if I don't fit it, well, then I'm not good at being a woman. And then I didn't know what I was going to do, right? Like, if I don't fit, what am I supposed to do? But what I found actually was the opposite. It actually gave me this freedom to live from my identity as a woman and to be able to live in this world in a way that I had longed for, but I didn't have the tools to understand until that moment. And so really the book was just the fruit of, I had gone on this journey myself, and I knew so many women who had struggled with some of the same thoughts, wondered the same things that I had wondered. And so I wanted to put it all in one place to be able to pass to somebody and say, listen, there's so much freedom in this genius that we have, as we call it. And I wanted to be able to pass that along to others, fruits of my own journey.
Now, they must have seen something in you, though, Lisa, because they asked you to give that talk. So what do you think that was? I mean, the organizers. So
yeah,
they asked you to give a talk on the femininity, and you're saying, well, it challenged me to deep dive it. I want to go into that journey, your process of deep diving, what it means, and discovering all this beautiful, beautiful stuff, basically. But I mean, they asked you.
Yeah. They did. Yeah, I know. I often wonder that. Why?
Did they say? I'm just
no, they didn't say. I think the talk the time before had gone well, right? And I kind of knew the right things to say, but in my heart, I wasn't really sure if I believed them. And so it was one thing to understand, okay, here's the right answers, or here's the right way to talk about it. At least at the time, what I thought was the right answer, the right way to talk about it. But it was another thing to get up on stage and say it, because then it was I'm owning that now, right? I am being a spokesperson for this thing that I'm not confident that I fully believe in, or that I fully myself have bought into.
So what were those things then that you, I guess, said originally that you were struggling with?
So there were a couple of things that came to mind. One would be, so from a biblical perspective, right? Looking all the way back in Genesis, the very beginning of time, very first chapter, we see in Genesis, God's creating man, he's creating woman, and he creates woman to be man's helper. And that word just rubbed me the wrong way. I was like, oh, really? That was why I was created, was to be a helper, right? Didn't like that. Also, I'd heard this phrase before of men and women are equal but different. And I grew up in the 80s and 90s, right? So in the 80s and 90s, very much what I was taught, what I remember hearing from, different avenues, plenty of places, right? It was this idea that well, anything a guy can do, you can do it better, right? There was this girl power that was really intense in the 90s, where we were really pushing women to assert themselves like men, right? Even the way that we dressed, women were dressing like men. They put their shoulder pads on so they would have broader shoulders to look more masculine. So there was this real push at this time to really masculinize women. And so growing up in that, I didn't want to be different from men, right? I wanted to be equal to them, and I wanted us to be the same, because that's what I was told. Well, to be a woman, is actually you're tough like a man, you do things like a man, you take over like a man, whatever it was. But this idea of being a woman seemed weak. It seemed less than, and it didn't seem like something that I would want. So I liked the idea of equal, but I wasn't sure about the idea of different. So those are a couple of the things that really stood out to me, that I was afraid of what the Catholic Church taught on that, right? So I was avoiding that topic, really, because, again, I thought there was a box I was going to have to fit into, and I didn't think I could do it.
Meaning this box, you hear the word helpmate, you hear the word submit, and these are trigger words for women raised with feminism, modern feminism.
Absolutely, yeah.
Who are told, like you said, to compete with men, and that even, women are better than men. We did a little episode on the movie Barbie recently, and it was very controversial, interestingly. And I totally, our producer here, Franco, was like, actually, Barbie had some really Catholic, Christian themes. Yeah. I'm like, okay, I'll give you some of those. But anyways, it's interesting though, because there is that representation of women don't need men. we're even superior to men. And I think in our culture today, there's a backlash to that perceived slight against men. And so you have men who are very feeling disaffected, unneeded. You know, this rising movement of it's called red pill on the internet, of men who feel like they don't really have a place in society because they've just been, blasted by feminism. And so in all of that confusion, I think your everyday woman is asking the question, okay, how do I be? You know, what does it look like to show up and be me, but to be the best, the best of me, when society seems to have so many different recommendations for what that looks like?
Absolutely.
So what do you think is the answer?
Well,
after your journey,
yes.
and let's go through that journey too of how you got to that answer. So maybe either start with the answer, then the journey, or the journey to the answer, whichever way you want to go.
Well, I had some clues for where I wanted to begin my research, because being in a Catholic organization, right, there were different buzzwords that were floating around as we talked about these things. And the biggest one that stuck out to me was this concept of feminine genius. And I knew it was a concept that had been introduced by Pope St. John Paul II, John Paul II. And so I thought, that's probably the place to start. And there were a couple of documents where he really dove into this topic of feminine genius. One being Mulieris Dignitatem, which is on the dignity and nature of woman. And then another one was just a short letter to women that he had written in 1994 before, at the prompting, at the asking of, I believe it was the UN was having a gathering of women. And they said, John Paul II, will you write a letter to this conference? And so he did that. So those were kind of the first two places that I began to look. Because being Catholic, right? That's going to be the first place I look. But I think it's important to note he speaks a lot about the feminine genius in these two documents, as well as other places. In the early 90s, he began to speak quite a bit about the gift of womanhood, the gift of women. And I think the reason he was doing that is because he was reading the signs of the times. He was recognizing here the world is telling women, hey, just become like men. And John Paul II was saying, whoa, 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 slow down. There's something unique about woman, something that she brings to the world that is utterly important. He calls it vitally essential. And so he, in his wisdom, began to address that and began to speak about it. And so I think going to those two documents was really the first place. And there were some things in there that I found that honestly shocked me. Just stuff that kind of was a curveball for me. I was like, whoa, 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 wait, what? I really didn't think that that's what Christians thought about womanhood, right? And John Paul II just kind of blew some of those things out of the water. So, the first one to kind of, flesh that out a little bit would be this idea of the helper. One of the first things I read about what he spoke about the helper was that this help, he says, is not one-sided, but mutual. And that for me was I'm sorry, what? My whole life, I really thought it was, okay, so woman was created to be man's helper, meaning woman was created to make man sandwiches, right? My 90s
or pick
upbringing.
Apples, or whatever.
Right,
Hopefully not the evil apple off the tree, which, again, is another narrative we could get into. Women are picking these, the Eve entered sin into the world. And so we'll get there. I do want to get there. But yes, I think that is the stereotype.
Yes. And it was something that I just kind of took as well, that's what that means, right? And then here I'm reading the works of John Paul II. He's talking about, no. Womanhood and manhood have this beautiful complementary, and they're called to help each other. And when they enter into this world living from how they were designed, right, then it makes the world more human. We actually find ourselves in our complementarity, in the fact that we were created to, in a sense, balance each other, right, to complete each other, not in the sense that a woman is, void without a man and she has to have a man to complete herself, but masculinity and femininity, when we have these two expressions, these two ways of living, this human nature that we have, when they come together, the full realization of humanity is brought forth.
Well, that's in his image. He created them male and female, and together we can manifest the glory of God, which is so beautiful. But that means working together and coming together too in one flesh can create new life. So you need, for the future of humankind, you need the masculine, you need the feminine, you need the woman, you need the man. Okay, that's so beautiful to understand helpmate through that lens of we're to help each other, and there's unique ways we can do that. What else did you discover in the journey that helped put your objections aside?
I think I also found out that as I was reading through John Paul II's documents, looking at his different words, I was realizing, sorry, when I say his words, I was realizing that there were certain kind of characteristics or aspects or gifts, you could call them, lots of words you could use for this, that he highlighted about women that I initially saw as negative things, right? Like, oh, women are, for example, like women are receptive would be one word where I was like, oh, well, that kind of seems like passive. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to just like sit back and wait for the man to like come to me and, just receive from him. But realizing, oh no, when he talks about it, the way he talks about it is this way. I've noticed it's active, right? Like there's an activity to receiving from somebody, right? So these different words that kind of reveal a bit about a woman in her, the way that she was created.
So it's an active, I remember encountering that phrase for the first time, active receptivity for women. Pope John Paul II using that term, if I remember it correctly. And it was very beautiful because there is something, physically we are designed for receptivity. I mean, when you look at, how life comes into the world, we are receiving a life into us, right? In order to birth that life. Women alone do that. It's a unique superpower we have to be mothers. And obviously the father is essential, but he has a different role. So the roles are different. But in that view, there's an active receptivity to it. We have to actively receive and choose. And ultimately, when we birth that child, we have to nurture. So there's so much for us to do. It's not just being done to us, so much for us to do. But we do accept at the same time this gift of a new life. Yeah. What else did you discover as you were reading about the feminine genius and femininity that helped you embrace the Christian teaching on it, as opposed to feel like, oh, this doesn't fit me?
Well, I think one thing comes back to, and kind of continuing on that spectrum of receptivity, right? Like the fruit of that is maternity, right? And for me, the idea of maternity growing up in the 90s, right? Growing up in a time when motherhood was really beginning to be something that was negative, something that we don't necessarily want, or maybe we want maybe just like one or two kids, but we don't want to have to like be burdened by our children, right? Motherhood is the fruit of receptivity. And so I then had a little bit of a trouble with this concept of motherhood. There's a lot of negativity around it, right? You don't want to be the overbearing mother. You don't want to smother. You don't want to, all these things, that was unfortunately just a negative view of motherhood was very much purported during my childhood. And so that was, I think, a piece of it as well. Not that I didn't want to be a mother, but the idea of having to be this like nurturing mother, or this mother who loved to like bake cookies and, this like June Cleaver kind of mother, right? Like didn't quite appeal to me. And so, but I thought that was what the Christian mother was supposed to look like, right? And so I wasn't really sure how to reconcile that. But then again, as I read about John Paul II's words on motherhood, I began to see that there isn't this tight box. I come back to this box over and over again because that's where I felt like I had to live, was in this box. I began to see that, no, there's like this, the way in which you live your motherhood, the way in which you express it, there's so much freedom and there's so many ways that you can do that. So I don't have to look like the stereotypical cookie cutter mother, but the way that I mother might look different, and that's okay. But the point is, am I nurturing, right? Am I helping this child to become who they were created to be? And that's a privilege to get to do. And for a long time, I saw that as a burden. And then all of a sudden, in seeing his writings, the way that he talked about the beauty of this maternity, I began to realize, oh no, that's actually something I do desire. And it's okay that it's not going to look like that cookie cutter box that I thought it had to look like.
7 Weeks Coffee is the best coffee company in America. Why? Because they have the most delicious coffee that is gourmet, organic. It is specially roasted. You can find the blends that you like. It's the best and most high-end coffee. It's also ethically sourced. But 7 Weeks Coffee, in addition, is a pro-life coffee company that is so dedicated to the mission to save lives that they give 10% of all of their revenue, not just profits, to pro-life pregnancy centers that are serving moms and babies and families. So go to 7weekscoffee.com, ditch whatever Costco or Pete's or Starbucks, God forbid, blend that you are drinking, and try 7 Weeks Coffee. I guarantee you will love this company. You will love this coffee. 7weekscoffee.com and use the code Lila at checkout for 10% off your order. It's very encouraging because there's so many different personalities among men and women just in the human family. And to say we have to live out being a mother one specific way in terms of the particulars. You know, you have to bake cookies, or, you know, you have to homeschool. I love homeschooling. I was homeschooled. I probably will homeschool. But even how you homeschool, because I think how if you homeschool, but, you know, how one woman will do it will look different than another. What do you think the saints, I know you write a lot about the saints, what can they teach us? And these are, you know, for those listening who are, you know, not Catholics, and I know we have a lot of those on the podcast, you know, a saint is a Christian who was so exemplary in their heroism that the Catholic or the Orthodox Church recognize them as, you are in heaven with God, and we're going to look to you for inspiration ultimately. So what are some of the things we can learn from the examples of the saints about womanhood?
Well, I think the first thing we can learn is this idea of the diversity within how we express our femininity. I mean, you look at the lives of the saints and they are all over the place, the way in which their genius was brought into the world, right? So we have women from Joan of Arc, who was out there fighting for her country of France, leading from a feminine place, not as a man, leading as a woman. And then we have this great saint who's known as Saint Therese of Lisieux, who was this quiet, contemplative, cloistered nun, right? Living in this convent where she never left the building and was just quietly praying, right? Two very different expressions of how they lived their feminine genius, but both of them have been risen up to be saints. And we see this all across the board. You see saints canonized in every time and age and space and place and language. And it shows us that there's this beauty here, that it's not meant to be stereotypical. We're not looking for, let's stereotype women. That's not what the feminine genius is about, is not stereotyping women. And so we see this so clearly when we look at the lives of the saints.
And it's for men too, because you look at the lives of the saints for men and you see that diversity of how they're living out their sanctity and their masculinity. And there's that same, you know, I know this is focusing on women here, but the beauty of this message is that it can be applied to men in terms of their own diversity and their own, you know, there's certain principles I think about masculinity too, but the way they're applied look different through different personalities and temperaments and, you know, giftings. So what are some of the things that you mentioned complementary with men? You mentioned that we are, you know, we have this active receptivity. What are some of the other things that are more uniquely feminine traits that you think are important for women to maybe wrestle with if they have an issue with it, but ultimately to embrace so that they can live it out in their unique way?
Yes, yeah. As I was reading through John Paul II's writings and works, I was looking for those words, right? What are those words that surface? What are those characteristics that come up over and over and over again? And it was really inspiring to see. I think I do want to say, so in my book, what I do is I pull out 8 of those words. One of them being maternity, another one receptivity. And then there's 6 other words. But these words, it's not a set list. I think that's really important, because I think sometimes we want to just like have that checklist of like, oh, here are the gifts of a woman. And I think that's really actually dangerous to do, because these gifts are not exclusive to one gender or another, right? Like they are what Pope Benedict would call, we are the privileged sign of certain gifts as women, because it's more suited to how we were created, to the way in which we, to our very makeup, right? And so some other words that I saw that popped up, again, these are not like black and white, like, okay, so this is what it means to be a woman gifts, and this is what it means to be a man gifts. That was one of my hangups too, right? I was afraid that it's like, these are traits that are feminine, these are masculine, and if you cross the line, well, then you fail, right?
But just to be clear, what you're saying when you're about to go through the list is that for women, you can explore this and become more fully, you know, who you're meant to be. But that's not to say a man can't use some of these traits and do the same. It's just these are tools almost for us to explore as women that will help us live out our womanhood.
Yes, things that Benedict would call the privileged sign of, right? So these are human traits, but for women, they are more natural because of how we were created.
So biologically, our reality, maybe, you know, we have more estrogen, we can mother, you know, those physical differences from men have a psychological, emotional impact that make these gifts at large, not for every woman, but generally speaking, more naturally, we have a more natural affinity to them. Am I understanding that?
Yeah. We are the ones who bring these gifts into the world and model them to the men in our lives who are called to live these gifts as well, but in their own masculine complementary way, right?
But it is possible for there to be a man or multiple men who more naturally espouse these gifts than say some group of women out there. So like you said, these are not this prescription for all, but it is something that's a good rule of thumb that we can look to.
Yes.
Perfect.
I think that's a great way of putting it. Sure. So some of the gifts would be interior strength, right? I think when we look at, some of just the baseline differences between men and women, men are naturally stronger physically, right? Greater lung capacity, denser bones, more muscle capacity, all that kind of stuff, right? But we see in women this unique interior strength. We have this ability, when the world is falling apart, we have this ability to keep it all together, and we have our eyes on everyone. I think about times of, like, if you're at a funeral or in a time of crisis, right? Women have their eye checking in on everyone, making sure everyone's okay. They have this ability to multitask in those times of trial, to be able to make sure everyone's being cared for, right? So this beautiful interior strength, I think, is something that is unique to women, right? We're the privileged sign of this. There's also, I think, a unique sensitivity that women have to the needs of others, right? So we notice when someone's hurting, right? We're aware of a situation. I think with this goes to this feminine intuition, this ability to kind of recognize a situation, look around and go, okay, this is what needs to be done, and this is how we need to do it. And sometimes we don't even know how we know, right? It's just like, I don't know, just like my gut says, this is what needs to happen right now. Or this person is feeling left out. This person is feeling hurt, whatever it is. We tend to kind of recognize that a bit more. And I think a lot of these gifts and things, they do come back to this reality that every woman has a capacity to mother, right? Like we all have a womb, or every is a strong word, right? But the design of woman is this ability to have to give birth, right? To be able to create a child. And so the gifting is there, needed for it. And when you look at some of these gifts, you realize like that's needed for the care of a child, right? You have to have some interior strength to be able to do that, right? It's hard being a mother. There's a lot of emotions that you go through when you watch your child suffer, or when you see your child making decisions and you're just like hoping that they're going to come around, hoping that they're going to come to a good place, right? Or that intuition that's so necessary for motherhood. I know you know that, Lila, as a mother, right? Or this sensitivity that a child deserves and needs for someone to see them. John Paul II talks about how women have this unique capacity to see people with their hearts. I think that that's just a great way to sum up, right, our ability to be sensitive to the needs of others, right? So a lot of these gifts, I think, kind of flow from this reality that like we were created with this sacred space. And so we have what is necessary in order to fulfill that. Now, whether or not a woman becomes a physical mother or not is actually not intrinsic to her femininity, right? Whether she becomes a woman or not, though, she's called to mother in this world. She's called to do this in a way for maybe it's in the workplace, right? Maybe she's a teacher or a nurse, or maybe she's working in the business world, but she still is called to bring this intuition, bring this sensitivity, bring this strength, bring this generosity. There's another word that John Paul II talks about. Women have this unique capacity to be generous to the point of heroism, right? Like we have to be heroically generous in our lives as women when we have been given this special charge of really caring for the prolification of life, right? Like that takes a lot of generosity to give over your body for 9 months, right? And that's one way it's expressed, but it's in us to do that. So you might see that in another place, in another way, in the way that a woman is generous in the workplace, or generous with her neighbors, or with her nieces and nephews, or her friends. There's this kind of natural capacity in us that was given because it was necessary for what it is that we have the ability to do as mothers.
So if there's a woman listening who is like, okay, this all sounds, pretty good. It seems like, you can understand what you're saying, but maybe it's not resonating at that core level. And I do see this a lot. And you kind of mentioned it earlier too, Lisa, that, because of, I think, our culture and just the human condition, like everybody has their different things they're dealing with or how they were raised. There are women, girls who maybe don't see themselves becoming a mother. Mm-hmm. That doesn't really connect with them at a deep level. There's a block there. Or maybe they don't see themselves wanting to be a wife, Yeah. So some of these traits that we're discussing, the generosity, the sensitivity, the intuition, it's like, no, that's not me. I'm not a man, but that's not me. What's the message for that woman or that girl?
Yeah, I think that sometimes, at least for me, when I would look at that, like I remember hearing sensitivity. That was one of my hangups. I was like, I don't cry during movies. Like, I'm not
even the
person.
Titanic, Lisa. No, I actually don't like that movie.
No, I remember laughing at the Titanic, right? Like, there was a ridiculous scene to me at the end when Jack sinks to the bottom. I'm like, she could have just let him climb on the board. Like, yeah, I wasn't moved by that, right? But I think what we have to do is first step out and ask, okay, are we looking at this from a perspective of what the secular world tells us this is and how we're supposed to live it? Or are we looking at this in the broader area of the way I express this might look different than my sister or my neighbor or whatever, and that's okay. So I think, again, it's this kind of almost ironic thing that really I thought the church was trying to box me in, but really I noticed that it's actually the world that's trying to box me in and tell me this is what feminine sensitivity is supposed to look like. You should be overly emotional, right? You need to cry at everything. You need to, be moved by romance novels, and like those things didn't do it for me. So like that wasn't how I expressed my sensitivity. But what I did find when I kind of did like an index and thought, okay, well, how do I live my sensitivity, right? Well, first of all, there's one thing in that I think the way we understand sensitivity that is a little different than how John Paul II is trying to explain it. His sensitivity is more like the ability to recognize the needs of others, right? To see that. And sometimes the result of that is tears, right? Sometimes the result of that is a deep emotional reaction. But that's not sensitivity itself. The tears are not sensitivity itself per se, right? So what I had to look at was, okay, well, what am I sensitive to, right? And like for me, if I see a kid on a playground who nobody wants to be friends with, like that brings me to tears, right? Like that's where my sensitivity kicks in and where I want to intervene and find that kid a friend, So
that's a lot more meaningful. I mean, than crying at some sappy movie, just because at the end of the day, the sensitivity is a gift to give to others, right?
Yes.
And to help others with. And so it's not just like you like pink and you look at, you cry at a movie or something, or you're like scared of the spider and you need your husband to come kill it or whatever it is. It's that you recognize, you notice, you have an empathy in you to see what others may need.
Yes.
And you want to help them.
Yeah. And so you really have to look at your own life and realize like, no, I think all of us do that. It's just, it might not look the way that you think that it's supposed to look according to what you have seen in this world. And I think once I started to do that and I started to look for how am I gifted in this way, or how do I live this gift uniquely as myself, then it began to open up this like freedom of, oh, I do that. I do that. I do live maternity. I'm not like super into babies, right? Like that stage is really hard for me. I don't just love to sit and snuggle and cuddle my baby all day long. I love my babies when I have my babies, right? But honestly, like I love the teen years, right? But it took me a while to get to teen years to recognize how much I love that and how fun it is to be able to walk with an older teen who's you can have deep conversations with and talk about life and talk about getting ready to prepare them for life outside the home, right? So I think that we each have different ways we're going to express these. And sometimes when we think about feminine gifts, we automatically just go to like a mother with a baby. And like that's their only vision of this. But that's really a short time in which you are living your motherhood. When there's like a whole lifetime in which you're mothering somebody, or a whole lifetime in which you can be spiritually mothering, as John Paul II called it, right? This idea of spiritual motherhood. And so the way you live it, there's just a freedom there when you recognize it doesn't have to fit one little box.
I think there's a lot of freedom. Freedom is a good word to use for that because women have different, natural desires and interests. And there's these different stereotypes, I think, that the world has for both women and men. Mm-hmm. But it's navigating that, yes, the principles are true. These are principles we want to live: a sensitivity to others, a generosity, a receptivity, be in collaboration with men, not competition. Mm-hmm. But how they're lived is really unique to the person. And that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Do you think, though, in some cases, like if there is a really extreme aversion to to children, right? Or there's a really extreme aversion to marriage or to men, or there's a really big hang up because those do exist. There's abuse in this world. There's, traumas. There's the way people were raised in a broken home, or there's, experiences that they had. There are disorders out there. There are wounds out there. So we're not talking about like embracing the disorder or the wound. Mm-hmm. We're talking about more just personality differences, temperament differences. What about those women who might have those wounds or who might have those hang-ups? What's the message for them or the path for them?
Two thoughts come to mind. First of all, that it's a hard question, right? It's a hard thing to answer, especially when that is such a sensitive topic for that woman who does feel like I have deep hurt towards men, right? I have deep wounds from my own mother, which makes me not want to be a mother. And the first thing is just like, I'm so sorry that the world has hurt you in that way, because that's real. That's completely real. People have been through through things that makes sense to me. That would be the natural outcome, right? Like to harden your heart to that and to not want to be anything to do with that. That completely makes sense to me. But I think what I come back to when I think of that, and this might be a hard answer to hear, but the reality is that we were made to love and be loved, right? So if we can't do that, then we have to recognize there's something in our life that has stolen that from us. And it's a hard thing to work through, and it's a hard thing to have to wrestle with. But I truly believe that each one of us, created in the image of God, who is love himself, has the capacity to love and be loved. But we sometimes have to break down those barriers first and work through those things. And putting up the wall is natural. In fact, I mean, that's one of those ways that women, sometimes our strengths can work against us, right? Like that emotional strength that a woman has can be used for good, but sometimes we can use it on the other side. We have that capacity to build up those walls and to say, I don't want to let anybody in, right? We have that emotional strength to shut people out, to shut down, and to just harden our hearts. But I think that God desires us to have the freedom to live from where we were created, which is a place of love. And so I guess I would just encourage that woman to really not be afraid to go to those places and ask herself, why? Why is it that I have this hardness of heart? And is there a place where God could come in and work and heal that? Is there a place where being in and seeing authentic love lived out, whether that be in a community setting, whether that be entering into the home of a family who has those healthy dynamics, to help see that was not how that was supposed to be, right? That was not God's intention, right? For that woman, that person to end up in that place, and to really take courage and step forward and to address that wound, to face it, and to allow the Lord to work and see, is this really like, nope, that's just how I am? Or is it, no, there's some healing that needs to take place. And that takes a lot of courage. And that's such a hard thing. Like I want to go to coffee with that woman. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to do. I want to go to coffee with her and talk with her and hear more about her story, because I'm sure those feelings are completely valid, right?
Well, and I think for some of these women too, I mean, I think about, the pro-life battle, and there's a lot of woundedness we see left and right with that fight. And, there's a lot of these, representations of it in pop culture. Yeah. So there was a skit by Chelsea Handler about a day in the life of a childless woman. And this is like on steroids, the extreme. I mean, it's a joke, but I think she is a childless woman, and she's very pro-abortion. I think she's very feminist, and her whole representation is like, I can go and have promiscuous sex. I'm not attached to any man. Oh, look, I don't have a baby. I can go do whatever I want. I can wear high heels. I can get on a jet plane. And, I don't have basically a stupid kid holding me back. I mean, is the whole vibe of this skit. It was very dark. There's a little funny to it in that, yeah, I guess, I can see maybe what you're talking about, that you don't, but you can do wonderful things with a child. I mean, it's not like a child keeps you back from being fully alive and having the best life. And a child is, I think, the greatest dream. But anyway, so this went viral. There's a lot of people talking about it, but the amount of people who liked it and shared it are like, yeah, having kids is such a drag, basically, was really sad.
Yeah. I mean, I've not seen the skit, right? But like when you say like, oh, the day in the life of a woman without a child, like there's a part of me that goes, oh, what would I do? Right? And like I begin to dream.
Probably not what Chelsea did.
Probably not.
She did some raunchy stuff. But yeah, what would your day be, Lisa?
It would be like, I sleep in, I go get coffee, I go pray in quiet.
You pray.
Right?
Okay, you pray for the world.
Right. But I could picture like the appeal of that. But actually, what do you say to that woman? I can see it, right? Like I could see, the appeal of that. But I think, at least for me, I think I would hit a point where that would get old, where I would feel like just living for myself would not be enough eventually, It's funny, on my way coming out here, my Uber driver, so as a speaker and an author, right, when I travel, you get in the car with the Uber and he asks, what do you do, right? Or where are you going, right? And so I'm like, oh, I'm a Catholic speaker and I'm going to this conference. Oh, what are you talking on? I have another book. It's called Dating Detox. And so that comes up. So immediately he's like, oh. And I said, yeah, it's not you that's toxic, right? You don't have to have been in a toxic relationship, but it's the world that you're dating in that's toxic. And he immediately was like, just like total trigger. He was like, oh, dating's horrible. It's awful. And he went on to explain this guy, he's 37 years old, not married, didn't have kids, right? But he was driving Uber in the morning because he grew up on a farm and he just was so used to hard work. But he had a full-time job, but he would just drive Uber in the morning because he just needed something to do. Like he just was up and at it. So hugely successful guy. He's like, Lisa, I've got 3 college degrees. I have a master's. He said, we live in Colorado. He said, I have a snowmobile. He said, I have a jet ski. I have a boat. I have this big, beautiful house.
He's like, why don't I have a woman?
Exactly. He was like, but honestly, like the one thing that I want, I can't get. Like the one thing I want is just to be able to like share my life with somebody and have a wife and build a family. And he's like, at this point, I just want to give up. 37 years old, right? Like, so he's seen a lot.
So he should stop riding Uber if he actually doesn't need it financially and use that time to treat dating like a job. Oh. That would be my advice.
I'll have to call him
what did you tell him?
I know. Well, we talked a little bit. I guess there's this girl who he's like, oh, I think that like this is not going to work out, but like we're still seeing each other. And so honestly, what I encouraged him, I was like, listen, if there's no future, then like, why are you holding on to this, right? Like there's nothing forward here. Like what's next? Like you're just holding yourself back from potentially finding what it is, you know, that forever for you, right? Very secular guy though. So it was a little hard to kind of navigate some of those, like, you know, advice, right?
Go meet her at church.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but it was an interesting thing because it sounds like this is the equivalent of what this woman is saying. And he's lived it and he's done it. And here he is in his Uber car talking to a perfect stranger about how it's not enough, right? Eventually, you know, he hit this point, 37, he's realizing like, I don't want to spend the rest of my life being alone, right? Like eventually I'm not gonna be able to ride around jet skis anymore. This isn't gonna be fun anymore, you know? So I think it comes back to the fact that like we were made to give ourselves to something and to someone. And we can fight that as much as we want. And we can act like, oh, no. Like living selfishly is where it's at. But I think our hearts eventually become restless from that because it's not enough. Just living for ourselves is not enough. And so that's a desire that I think has been written on our heart. Here's an interesting thing too. Okay, this is like a hard turn from where we were just at. But I think one thing too that's interesting about when you look at the history of the world, right? Up until the Protestant Reformation, right? The world post Jesus, right, was Catholic, was Orthodox, right? And there's this interesting vocation, as we call it in the church, right? This interesting like way in which you can live that you choose that was available to women that is kind of foreign and strange now, that was completely normal back then, like very normal. And that was this call to being in religious life, which was a life of, it could be a couple of things. One, you could choose to be a religious sister, be a nun, right? You could enter into a convent and you could be in a community of other women who were working together to produce good in this world, right? They were serving, they were teaching, they were working in hospitals. Some of them were what we call cloister, which meant that they just spent their lives in quiet contemplation, praying for the world. That was their job, right? To pray for the world. But then we also had this vocation that really we have not seen for about 500 years. I don't know when it fell off, but it's very rare now, to the single life. And it was consecrated single life. So these women who said, I don't feel called to get married. I don't feel called to have children. I also don't feel called to join a religious order. And so they became some different names for this in different places, like a tertiary would be one word for it, a beate, that's a French word for it. And these were single women who lived their lives in the world, but made a decision and said, I don't want to get married and have children. And not because they hated it or rejected it, but because they said, I want to live a life that's radically available to serve in this world. And that was this beautiful vocation that so many women chose and lived that I think at the time of the Protestant Reformation, and we have to remember this was 500 years ago, right? So this is not all Christians now by any stretch. But part of the idea of the Protestant Reformation was that there was this belief that that was an improper way for a woman to live, right? A woman should not be able to be single. In fact, the proper way for her to live was as a wife and mother. Therefore, she must get married. And
that was the push for priests to get married too, right? Like exactly. Marriage was set up as this kind of penultimate vocation, as opposed to, no, the celibate life is a life to admire and live for many people.
And it's a perfectly valid thing to choose, right? And so these women during the Protestant Reformation, as they would come in, and again, this is like a long time ago, and I understand that Protestants are not doing this now, so I'm not angry at Protestants.
Well, I think there's a lot of women in the Protestant world and the Catholic world, but I hear it from the podcast all the time who say, there's no place for me in the church as a single woman.
Yes.
I hear that all the time. We hear that on the podcast. I hear that from our listeners. And so I do think it's a real felt need that it's like, where's our place in the church?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like this is the fruit of this action, where they were pulling women out of convents and saying, this is not a proper way for you to live. The proper way for you to live is to get married, to have a husband, to bear children for him, and to be there to please him in some senses.
And
right?
if you don't do those things, you're less than as a woman.
Yes.
And that is the message I think, unfortunately, a lot of Christian women receive in the church today. If you're not married, if you don't have kids, then somehow you're less than.
Yes.
Okay, guys, you've heard me talk about Public Square before in the podcast. What are you waiting for? Public Square is the Yelp for conservatives. That means that Public Square is an app that you download for free, and it's a directory of over 75,000 businesses that support your values, that are pro-life, pro-family, pro-freedom. These are companies that sell everything from kids' clothing to makeup to household items. You can find food businesses on there. Any kind of business that you can imagine, you're going to find on the Public Square app. So download the Public Square app for free. You can also list your company, your pro-life, pro-family company there as well. Use the link in the bio to download the Public Square app for free today and check out the largest growing directory of pro-life, pro-family businesses in America.
Yeah. And it's heartbreaking, right? Because it forces women into something that maybe they don't feel called to, but they also don't have this option that they used to have that was widely normal, widely accepted. So many of the saints, again, like these people, right, who we raise up, people don't realize this, but a lot of them were consecrated singles, right? So Catherine of Siena, she looks like she's wearing a habit. So she's to give back who she is, right? She is a saint who actually was very involved in the political world of her time. And she would go and she would speak to diplomats, to kings, to the Pope, and advise them. And they would call upon her to come and mediate at times when there were family feuds, right? She was the one they called upon. The Pope actually, a couple times called Catherine and said, could you go talk to this person? Because we're not able to settle our differences, right? And she wasn't a religious sister. She was a consecrated single. She lived her life. She lived at home. She, was with her family where she lived because at the time that made sense, right? But that was a very valid vocation for her. And she was very involved in the world in a unique way that probably is surprising to some people when you look at our world today. And so I think that there's an answer to this question that might seem a little different, might seem a little radical, seems obviously very foreign in our world today. But the idea that, at least in the Catholic Church, that a woman's only place is in the home, being a wife and a mother, is actually very false. It's very false. And that's why I say being a mother is actually not a physical mother. It's actually not intrinsic to femininity, because we have this vocation of religious life where these women forego physical motherhood. They say, that's not for me, but they radically live spiritual motherhood. And they mother those who are in the margins, right? Those who are marginalized. We see so many of our religious sisters doing amazing things for people as a community. And then we also see these single women. We actually have a couple of consecrated women that I know in my community in Denver. And it's so fun to see them, because one of them is a nurse, right? She's a nurse, right? Like she's living her life. She has her own job, right? She has her own finances, all this, but she's made that choice that this is my vocation. And she's immensely supported in that and loved in that, and is very much a part of the fiber of our community. And another one who works, and she does apostolic work, which means she works for the church, doing work there, and is able to give in this radical way where she's chosen. And it's not seen as shameful or, well, you just couldn't find a husband, how embarrassing, right? Like, no, like this is life she chose and she declared. And they're so happy. They're so beautiful.
What a difference between a day in the life of a childless woman, Chelsea Handler's day, and a day in the life of a childless woman, the Catherine Siena Day, St. Catherine of Siena Day, or, Sister Bethany Madonna. I was talking with her recently. She was out here for Live Action's Life Awards Gala, and, she wanted to be a mother of children, biological children. She felt called to be a sister of life, is what she is now, a sister, and, consecrated, a celibate. But now she has children in another way. And the principle that you're sharing, which is so beautiful, Lisa, is that we're all called as women and men to give. Gifted givers. We are given to love. And so give that love back. And that is the only way ultimately we can be fully alive and free, is to love. If we're not giving our life for love, we are wasting our life. And that's unfortunately the stereotype of the Chelsea Handler videos. Like, this is all about me versus the life of, you're a childless woman, but you are still fruitful in loving others because your life is about service. Well, and last question for you. What about the masculine genius? Does it exist? We're talking about the feminine genius. The church has written all of this, St. John Paul II. Is there a masculine genius?
I don't think so. I'm just kidding.
Feminist,
of course there is. Yes. Of course there's a masculine genius, right? There's a complementary side to this. There's these unique gifts. And we actually never really defined the feminine genius, which is, maybe I'll do that real quick.
Sure, go for it, yeah.
What is the feminine genius? At the tail end of the podcast here. The easiest way to define it is it's the person-oriented disposition of woman. And that's revealed in our very bodies, right? Like, our very bodies reveal that we are oriented towards the person. And that's a beautiful thing. It's not something to be ashamed about. It's not something to try to get rid of. It's not something to try to erase.
Aren't men's bodies oriented the same way?
Yes, but we have a unique way in which our body is oriented towards it, very interior. Man's body is more exterior.
So that would be the masculine genius would be perhaps those more exterior traits and skills, and the feminine genius would be more the interior focused traits and skills and abilities.
Yes. Yeah. So I think, let me give you one of my favorite analogies on this, right? In comparing the masculine and feminine genius, right? So it's the unique gifting of woman, and then there's like the unique gifting of man that are complementary, that work together to make the world more human, right? So this analogy is my favorite analogy because I think it really clearly shows how this works. And it's from a friend of mine who had this exact experience. So one night, he and his wife were sleeping, and it was, middle of the night. They had 2 kids, babies are out, and all of a sudden they wake up with a start and they realize someone's just broken into their house. And like, what happens at that moment without anybody thinking, right? The husband goes into protector mode, right? He's like, I will protect my family. And he grabs what he can to defend his family, and he goes to confront the intruder and scare him out of the house, right? And what does the wife do in that moment, right? I think sometimes the stereotype that we like to play, like in old-timey movies and things, is, well, now she's the damsel in distress, right? Like the defenseless woman who can't do anything and is just waiting to be saved, right? No. She goes into protector mode too. Actual real scenario. What does she do? She runs to the rooms of her babies, right? And she begins to protect her kids, right? And so both of them are protecting in that moment without even thinking. They're working together to protect their family, right? So these gifts are not exclusive, right, to one gender or another, but the way in which we naturally, just like without even thinking, right? He's like, go shield my body, like be the first line of defense. And if I go down, I go down. Where she's like, go get the kids, be the first defense, to protect the kids while he's trying to distract, right? And there's something beautiful and natural about that I think we've lost a lot in our society because we live in a very comfortable world where those kinds of moments are not as needed. But previous to, in the first, I don't even know how long the world's been around, but right, like that was super necessary. And the reason that the woman was protected was not because she was weaker. It was not because she was inferior or she was less than, but because she was the future. Right. So in the tribal world, like, you would send the men to the front line because in a sense, and this is going to sound horrible at first, but like they're more dispensable, right? Like if all the women die, like then that's it. That tribe, that community is over, right?
Meaning you only need one man and you could, and polygamy is
yeah,
what you're saying.
Yeah, you could repopulate the world with one man and 50 women. But if it's the reverse scenario, like that's it, right? Like, I mean, it'd be really hard to regenerate.
Well, and her job, like you said, is the kids. So she's going, not to say his job isn't the kids and her job isn't, but the point is he's protecting her and the children. She's protecting the children.
Yes.
And they're all involved, both the man and the woman, in protection.
Yeah. Because what does a good species do, right? A good species continues, right? When we see this in nature, like that's what they're fighting for. That's like their whole life, right? We have an intellect. We have an ability. Well, we're different than the animals in that way. So we obviously are going to approach this a little different. But when you strip all that back, like, it only makes sense, right? That would be the first thought of a man, right? And the first thought of a woman, because that's what we're doing, right? We're protecting the future. We're protecting our species so we can move forward, right?
And the vulnerable, like from the spiritual perspective, like we are called to protect those that are more vulnerable than us. And yes, women are physically typically more less strong than men.
Yeah.
Physiologically. And so there's a reality to that. That's the reason like the man will typically walk on the outside of the sidewalk, like as a tradition, but he's bigger and stronger. And obviously she's bigger and stronger than the child. So there's a, you could call it a natural physical hierarchy there that also kicks that protectiveness into action.
Yeah. And it's not about trying to demean women or make them less than. It's just the reality of like, this is our future, right? Like there's value in a woman for what she brings into this world. And so we want to protect that value.
What happened to your friends?
Everything was fine. Yeah.
Was it? Yeah. What did he? Did the
he ran off.
The husband went downstairs and he got scared and ran.
Yeah, as soon as he recognized somebody's in the house.
Awesome.
Like, yeah.
Phew.
I know. I was like, wait. Yeah.
Lisa, how can people find your work and get your book, Reveal the Gift?
So the book is from Ascension Press, and so you can get it on ascensionpress.com. Also, of course, on Amazon. The book again is Reveal the Gift. And then I have a website, madetomagnify.com. You can find me there.
Beautiful. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Lisa.
It has been a joy.
Thank you guys for listening to this episode of the Lila Rose podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Would love your thoughts. As always, please email me at lila@gtbmedia.com. I love to hear from you guys. Also, a big shout out again to our Patreon supporters. Please join our Patreon if you feel led, any amount. We have people at $50, at $100, at $5. Our Patreon supporters are helping fuel this podcast. So check out our Patreon at the link in the bio, and we will be doing a live stream once a month with Q&As for our Patreon supporters. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your week.